Hi, I'm Phil at the Soundproofing store, and today we're at the Sportsman's Arms Hotel and Restaurant in Pateley Bridge in Yorkshire. And what an absolutely stunning place this is. Now, the Sportsman's is owned by the Carter family, and they reached out about a little noise problem they're having. And this is Jamie to tell us all about it. Hi, Jamie.
Hi, Phil.
So tell us about the Sportsman's.
So the Sportsman's Arms has been within our family for almost 50 years now.
Wow.
And it's a small countryside inn, and we have 11 rooms for accommodation, a restaurant and a bar. So a busy small business in the middle of the Yorkshire Dales.
Absolutely, and a beautiful one at that, I've got to say. Now, you reached out because you've got a noise problem. Tell us all about it.
Yeah, the main building is absolutely fine. It's the construction is solid, very thick masonry walls. However, we more recently had a barn conversion done of a disused barn towards the back of the property, and that's more modern construction techniques. So stud walls and wooden floors, which we've found to be a problem with noise whilst people are staying.
Okay, so the barn's down this way. So lightweight stud walls separating the rooms, timber floors with plasterboard ceilings. It's all very lightweight.
Yeah.
Sounds travelling through very easily. And how does that affect things as a hotel?
People come to this part of the world for a bit of tranquility and peace. And the last thing that we want to do is send them home having had a disturbed night's stay because of noise generated from rooms either side.
Especially when it's not something that you can control. You do everything else that you can absolutely perfect to give them a lovely time, but then a neighbour next door snoring or watching the TV at night can potentially ruin that, and that's not something that you're able to control as a hotel.
We try to make sure that people leave having a lovely stay, and we want them to come back. And we work very hard to do that. However, like you say, people often leave televisions on, or people can have problems with snoring, and that can really dampen their experience of our hotel.
Well, we're going to try and fix that for you, Jamie.
Perfect.
So we're going to treat the wall and we're going to treat the floor. But what we're going to do for the viewers at home is split them up into two separate videos, so it's not too long. So if you're currently watching our wall video but want to find out about the floors, there will be a link in the description, and vice versa. If you're watching the floor video, we'll have a link to the wall video as well. Now we're going to go inside and have a look at the room. So we're inside one of the troublesome rooms, and this is the main wall in question that separates this room from the room next door. Now, we decided to treat this side because the other side in that room is a bit too complicated with things like radiators, doorway positions. Now, if we could treat both sides, that'd be even better. You'd get even better results. But even just doing one side is going to make a big difference. And this was certainly a simpler side. And what we've got here is very typical of an internal wall. It's a timber stud. So we've got a timber frame with vertical studs. And on either side of that frame is just a sheet of standard plasterboard, which is relatively thin and relatively lightweight. Now, in this case, we're a little bit luckier that there is already some insulation in there. We've got some fiberglass in there that was put in at the time that it was built. And that is at least helping solve one problem, which is the drum effect, which is where if you have a completely hollow stud wall and sound gets inside of that hollow cavity, the sound is going to bounce around in there and resonate and actually amplify, becoming even louder. So if you have a stud wall that you're trying to soundproof and it's completely hollow inside, you'll have to remove one of the layers of plasterboard so you can expose the frame, fill the frame with an acoustic insulation, and then put a plasterboard back on, and then the soundproofing treatment. But in this case, because it's already insulated, and we know it is because we've taken out some of the socket boxes and had a look inside, so we can keep this board in place and just add the soundproofing over the top of it. The main problem that we're trying to solve now, the second problem with the stud wall, is that they're very lightweight. And sound is predominantly blocked by mass. So the heavier and the more dense the wall is, or the materials on the wall is, the harder it is for sound to physically pass through it. It's creating more of a barrier for the sound. And at the moment, it's just not a very good barrier. There's not enough mass there. So what we're going to do today is install our SoundBoard 4, and we're going to have a little look at that. Now this is a ProSound SoundBoard 4. This is our most popular product for soundproofing lightweight stud walls. The main idea is that it adds a huge amount of mass. Now the SoundBoard 4 comes in 1.2 meter by 1.2 meter boards. The boards are 29 kilograms per meter square, which works out at almost 42 kilograms per board. So very, very heavy, definitely a two-man lift. The board is made up of 4 layers, which is why we call it the SoundBoard 4. We've got a layer of mass-loaded vinyl, which is basically a very heavy, very dense rubber membrane. Okay, it adds a lot of mass to the wall. We then have a layer of acoustic closed cell foam, and this is a slightly squishy foam which basically isolates the heavy hard part of the board from the hard wall, and it gives us some isolation and some ability to dampen the energy and the vibration of sound. We then got another layer of the mass loaded vinyl to add more mass again, and finally a 15mm acoustic grade plasterboard. Now it's acoustic grade because it's basically denser and heavier than a standard plasterboard. So again, adding even more mass. But because it's a plasterboard, and this is the layer that's gonna finish the wall, you can plaster and decorate and treat this like any other plasterboard wall. So it's basically ready for plastering and decoration once it's been installed. But before we install the board, we're gonna do a quick test. Okay, so before we start the installation, we wanted to do a little test so we can test before and after and show you the difference that it's made. Now, we wanted to keep the test in this situation more relevant to the noise problem that we're actually trying to solve. So what we've done is gone into the bedroom next door, we've turned on the television and cranked it up to a decent volume, okay? So we're hearing music, we're hearing voices talking, which is a lot more like what people in the hotel room are actually going to be hearing. Guests next door talking or watching the television, okay? Now, we've used one of our handheld decibel meters next door to measure the volume that it is in that room, and it was averaging around 70 decibels, okay? So what we're going to do now is measure what the volume is like in this room. We're averaging around 57 decibels, 57, 58, which means at this volume, the stud wall is reducing around 13 decibels, 12 or 13. So that is what we're trying to improve. Okay, just a couple of quick points to talk about before we get started. So before we arrived, Jamie has already taken off the skirting boards. You will need to do that. If you only soundproof down to the top of the skirting board, you're basically leaving that whole section of the bottom of the wall untreated. And sound will always find the weakest point, okay? Soundproofing is like waterproofing. You need to cover the entire wall, or sound will find the bit that you've not soundproofed and it'll still come through. So we've got to go all the way down to the floor, all the way up to the ceiling. So we've prized off the skirting board so we can go all the way down. If you have got coving or any kind of detail up at the top where the wall meets the ceiling, that's going to have to come off too. With more modern covings, you may be able to prise it off gently and replace it, put it back on again, but it may get damaged and you may have to replace it later. Another point is we've got some sockets on the wall. Now, because the SoundBoard 4 is 30mm thick, we're obviously going to bring the wall 30mm further forward. So the sockets will need to be brought forward as well. And again, Jamie has already taken out the socket box, put a little block of wood inside and put the socket back on. So it's pushed it 30mm further forward, which is great. And we'll talk about how we're going to treat the sockets a little bit later on. A couple of awkward points is, although this is the main separating wall between this room and the next room, because of the shape of the next room, the room actually carries on around this corner and actually ends around here, where there's then a doorway into the hallway. which means if we only soundproof this wall, to a degree, some of the sound is actually going to come down this section and through this part of the wall. So we also need to soundproof the returning wall as well. Now, in a perfect world, we would go all the way along and do this whole wall, so it's all nice and even and there's no difference in levels. But because of things like the door frame and some awkward details, Jamie has opted to just go up to where we're passing the wall for the next room and then stop in there, which does mean there'll be a slight difference in level, but for a hotel room it's not too important. No one's really going to notice that, but it will be enough to solve the problem. We're crossing over the border with the next room, so that's absolutely fine. And the last thing is, with it being a very old property with historical details, we do have this awkward section down here where we've got this old oak beam and then the old external stone wall of the property. And what we're going to have to do is scribe the edges of the boards so it follows around this shape. And then down in the corner, we have this window that actually continues past the stud wall and into the next room, which means at that point, the only thing separating this room from that room is the window frame. So we're going to have to continue the boards right the way up past the window frame as well. So that makes things a little bit more awkward, a little bit trickier, but it can all be worked around. Now, in a perfect world, you want to make good the plasterboard that's already on the wall, because if there's any holes in it, then the plasterboard that's there isn't really going to be doing much, which means the soundboard 4 is doing all the work, which is fine. That's already going to make a massive difference. But if you can combine the mass of the existing plasterboard and the soundboard 4, it's going to do even better. So if you've got any holes where you've removed sockets or moved anything over, then you want to fill that back in with a little offcut of plasterboard just to seal it up the best that you can. And then we're going to add the soundboard 4 over the top of that and get the combined performance of the soundboard 4 and the existing plasterboard. So we'll start with the first board, and the easiest way is always to start with your bottom row in one corner, work your way along, and then we go up to the next row where we can sit the board on top of the first board. So start on the floor. What we need to do is use these 5mm packers to raise the board up off the floor and off the adjoining wall, because what we don't want is for the boards themselves to be rigidly touching the surrounding surfaces, so the floor, the ceiling and the returning walls. So what we're doing is just slightly lifting the board up, slide in 2 packers underneath the board to raise it 5mm off the floor, and put some packers down the side and shuffle the board along up against it like that. And then what we're going to do is fix the board in place, and once we've fixed all the boards, we're going to have that 5mm gap going all the way around the very perimeter of the wall, and we're going to seal that up with some acoustic sealant. Okay. Now the reason why we do that is because sound is a vibration energy. It's a physical energy, and that vibration can transfer through different surfaces if they're directly touching. So by keeping the materials on this wall and the materials on that wall and the materials on the floor slightly isolated from each other, you stop what we call flanking vibration, which is where the vibration of the sound transfers from the wall into the floor, or from that wall into that wall, and so on. So a couple of quick things to mention. First of all, because our socket landed right in the middle of our first board, we've had to cut out a hole for the socket. And that's fine. All we've done is basically put the board in the right position, pushed it up against the socket box so it made a guideline on the mass-loaded vinyl side, and used a drill and a jigsaw just to cut out the socket shape. So the board now slots straight over our socket box nice and neatly. We're now going to fix the board in place. Because this is a stud wall, we want to make sure that the vertical timber studs are supporting the weight of the board. So you don't just want to screw onto the plasterboard, you want to make sure you're screwing through the plasterboard and into those studs. Again, these are very, very heavy boards. You want to make sure they're nice and secure. Now, as you can see on the floor, we've marked out the positions of our vertical studs. We've just used a line of masking tape and drawn on the location. There's various ways to find the location of your studs if they are already covered with plasterboard like they are in this case. Something like a stud detector from a DIY shop is ideal. And as you'll see throughout this video, the installation is being done by Jamie himself. He's a handy fella, he's got DIY skills, he does a lot of the maintenance and the DIY work around the hotel. So it's not something that you need a professional soundproofing installer to do. It's a very DIY-able job. The vast majority of our customers who are installing the soundboard in particular will just install it themselves. If you're not a DIYer, that's fine. Just a local builder or tradesman is really all you need. The complicated part of soundproofing is knowing what to do in what situation, and that's what we help you with. In terms of actually installing the system, they're very straightforward. We provide full step-by-step instructions, these handy videos to show you exactly what you need, and we're on hand for full technical support throughout. So if you have any questions, just give us a call. But today, Jamie's going to do this himself with just a little bit of help from me. Now, in terms of fixings, because we're screwing into timber, we're just going to use drywall screws, just timber suitable drywall screws. Now, in this case, we've got to get through 30mm of the soundboard 4, 12.5mm of the existing plasterboard, and then we want a good kind of 30mm purchase into the timber. So we're using 75mm length drywall screws in this case. So we're putting the second board against the wall now. One question we get a lot is from people saying, do we butt the boards up against each other or do we leave a gap between the boards? Okay, now the only place you purposely leave a gap is around the perimeter of the whole wall, not between the boards, okay? So we're using the packers to give us that 5mm gap between the wall and the floor, the wall and the ceiling, the wall and the returning walls. But the boards themselves, you want to butt up against each other tightly. We don't really want any gaps. Now, saying that, if the wall isn't perfectly straight and perfectly level, sometimes it can be difficult to get the boards absolutely butted up against each other. So at the end of the installation, we are going to run a bead of acoustic sealant over all the joints to make it as airtight and sealed as possible. But when you're screwing the board on, you want to get it as tightly up against the next board as you can. Now, I just wanted to do a quick talk about the importance of scribing the edges of your board around the perimeter of the wall. Now, this is a very extreme case, and I'm sure not many people are going to have things like this to work around. But you can see the way that we've had to draw out and measure the shape that we're installing against to cut the board perfectly, so this will slot in like a jigsaw puzzle. Now, like I say, this is very extreme, but even in a lot of domestic cases where you're just going up against what is seemingly a relatively straight wall, but actually if you put a spirit level against it, it just slightly kind of waves and undulates. Now the problem with that is people will, just to do the job quicker, will take a straight edge piece of plasterboard and just push it up against the edge. And what happens then is you'll have parts of the wall where the plasterboard is completely touching, and you'll have parts of the wall where the plasterboard's 10 or 15 mil away. When it's all installed and you look at the side, there's great big gaps in certain areas, no gaps in other areas, and that's just not going to work. We need to maintain that 5 mil gap for two reasons. One, as I explained earlier, we need there to be a small gap which we then fill with acoustic sealant so that the board isn't touching the surrounding surfaces. But at the same time, that acoustic sealant only works as a seal up to 5 or 6 mil. If the gap is bigger than that, the sealant won't actually seal it properly. So you're then going to find after installing the system, you're still getting sound coming through, and it's getting through those big gaps. So you need to make sure if you've got a slightly wavy wall or a bit of an awkward place, you've got to scribe the shape that you're cutting out onto the plasterboard, cut the plasterboard to the same line so it all slots in and maintains that nice 5 mil perimeter gap. So now we're installing the second layer of board, okay? Now, because we're getting it up high, you've got to lift up that weight, so make sure you've got two people here to help lift the board up. But once it's up, you can sit the board on top of the first layer. So it's actually, the weight is being held by the first row of boards. An important part is we want the vertical seams of the boards to not match up with the vertical seams of the first layer. So we're creating almost like a brick bond pattern by staggering the boards. Now you can do that by cutting a half-size board and using that. Or in this case, we've got an offcut from the first layer, so we're just going to use this offcut. It's about maybe a third of a board. So by putting this on first, it means our second board is going to land about here, and the seam won't match up with the seam of the first layer. Beautiful. Okay, so the last board is up on this side. We can already tell a massive difference. The volume of the TV next door, we've just put it back on at the same volume, and you can still just about hear it, but it's a lot lower, a lot more muffled than it was before. And we've not even sealed it up yet. So all we're going to do now is go around the perimeter where we've got the 5 mil gap all the way around the edge. We're going to run a bead of sealant into that. But we're also going to go over all these seams and joins just to make sure it's as airtight as possible, maybe even some of the screw heads or any little gaps that we can see. Now, I'm just going to talk through the options when it comes to sockets. Okay, now this is something that you probably want to decide on how you want to approach this right at the start, so you know what you're doing. but I'm going to talk you through the two different options. Now, in a perfect world, if you want to achieve the best level of sound reduction, the best way of dealing with sockets is to actually pull the socket box right out and free up your cable. Get rid of the recessed socket box that you've currently got. And when you install the boards, you just want to make a very, very small hole, just enough to pull your cable through the plasterboard, okay, through the soundboard itself, and then install a surface mounted socket box on top of the soundproofing and reconnect it up to your cables. Now that way, the soundproofing is completely continuous. It's covering the entire wall, except for just a very small hole where your cables are coming through, which you can seal around with a little bit of acoustic sealant. But your socket box will be sat in front of the soundproofing. You're not actually removing soundproofing to put a socket inside. And so that's going to maintain the soundproofing across the whole wall and give you the best possible results. However, it does mean that you're going to be left with a socket box that sticks out from the wall, which some people will be more than happy with. But other people won't like the look of that and will want the sockets to be nice and recessed. In this case, with it being a hotel room, there's going to be a double bed right here and a bedside table right in front of this socket, and they'll have lamps plugged in and such. So they don't want big socket boxes sticking out from the wall. They want a nice traditional recessed. So if you would prefer a recessed socket, you're not going to get quite as good a result. But to minimize how much of a weak point the socket is, what you're going to need is what we call an acoustic putty pad. And what this does is it's a incandescent putty. It's got a texture almost like a sheet of blue tack or Play-Doh. It's very, very flexible, very malleable. You can literally tear a piece off and roll it up in a ball. So it's very, very easy to use. And the idea is you would either completely take the socket box out and wrap the back of the socket box in the putty pad and then put it back inside. Or what can be easier, and what we're going to do in this case, is just pull all the cables through. Obviously you need to make sure these cables have all been made safe or your trip switch turned off so you can touch these cables safely. And what we're going to do is actually insert the putty pad inside the inside of the socket and just tear some little holes to go around the cables and then seal it back up again. And it's just basically going to seal the socket box up, make it nice and airtight, add a little bit more mass to the back, and just minimize how much sound can get through. And that should certainly make a big difference. Now, a common question we do get asked is, can I put my pictures back on the wall? Can I hang my mirror back on the wall? A lot of people panic that putting in a screw or a nail is suddenly going to undo all the soundproofing. You haven't got to worry about that at all. Small, relatively lightweight things like pictures, you can just put a little tack nail into the wall, that's fine. The little hole that you're creating is then filled by the nail. So it's plugged, that's not a problem. So you can put your pictures up. Heavier things like big heavy mirrors, it's probably best to find where your timber studs are and screw through the soundproofing into the stud, so the stud is supporting the weight, or at least use some very heavy duty drywall anchors. TV brackets you can fix onto the wall, again ideally into the stud behind, but you can fix through the soundboards. Radiators, the same, you can mount them onto the wall, that's not a problem at all. Okay, so the important part is how much sound has it reduced? So to recap, we set the volume to 70 decibels in the next room, and before the soundproofing, we were averaging around 58 decibels in this room. So let's see where we are now. Okay, so we're averaging now around 37 to 38 decibels. So that's a further roughly 20 decibels from where we were before, which means that's roughly about 32 decibels that the wall is now reducing compared to about 12 or 13 pre-soundproofing. So it's really made a massive difference. But more importantly than the numbers and the decibels, that actually doesn't really mean that much to a lot of people. In the real world, we could hear the difference. As each board was going onto the wall, you could literally hear the sound kind of moving to the side of the wall that wasn't yet soundproofed. And when you put on that last board, it just went muted. It's almost like when you're driving down the road with your window down, and as you wind it up, it gets a little quieter and a little quieter, and you close that last gap and the sound suddenly muffles. And especially filling in all the gaps and sealing it all up, just each last little bit of detail that we did, you can hear the sound getting less and less. And now standing on this side, you can barely hear the faintest muffle of a sound from the next side. Whereas earlier, we could literally have a conversation through the wall quite easily. So it's made a huge, huge difference. Now, if you've got a stud wall that you're looking to soundproof, to give you a bit of an idea, the installation took us about a day, I'd say. Now, we were stopping and starting with filming and things, but in terms of actually the time that we spent installing the system, we basically got it done in a day. In terms of cost, we've covered about 12 meters square, and the cost for the materials themselves, and that's all the accessories, so sealants and tapes, the boards themselves, VAT, delivery, all in, came to just under £900. Okay, we're going to do a quick walkthrough test. So we're now on the other side of the wall in the unsoundproofed room, okay? And we've brought a little Bluetooth speaker with us. We're going to play some music. We're going to crank it up quite loud, much louder than you would naturally have the TV on or that you would be talking to someone in a room. So it's more of an extreme test. We're going to switch the sound to a little microphone that picks up the sound for the whole room, not just my voice, so you can really hear the music. And then we're going to walk around to the soundproofed side and see the difference. Are we ready? Okay, so for you to hear me over this music, I really have to project my voice. So this is pretty loud, okay? So this is the wall that we soundproofed. This was the corner that went around where we had to soundproof the return. I'm gonna close this door, then close this door. We're now in the room that we treated. And I mean, you can just about hear a very low, very faint, very muffled amount come through. You can still hear something, it's not completely 100% soundproof, but as we knew, there's always going to be a little bit of sound that's going to come up through the floor or over the ceiling. But it is miles better. It really is a night and day difference from where before we could hear everything almost as if you were in the same room. You can hear something, but it's very low, very faint and very muffled. Huge, huge difference. So we're back in the room. We've got Jamie back with us. And as you can see, the wall it's been plastered, it's been painted. You're in the middle of redecorating, aren't you? It looks nice and smooth. You wouldn't know that there'd been any soundproofing there. If you were a hotel guest, it just looks like any other wall. How did you find the process, Jamie? What did you think of the product and the installation?
I thought the product was great. I was actually really surprised how easy it was to do. I've never done any plasterboarding before. It's probably something that initially I wouldn't attempt, but having now done it, I would recommend that it's easy enough for anyone to do at home. It was surprisingly simple. A few tricky parts, but that was down to the room, which is where you have to cut little bits of board, but the actual product itself was super simple to cut and super simple to install, so it wasn't an onerous task.
Just taking the time to scribe around those awkward little areas.
Yeah, absolutely, but that's not the product. I think it's more a couple of intricacies of the room.
The character.
Yeah, something like that.
And how have you found it since it was all done? Obviously, you've had a couple of weeks where you've been in here, kind of redecorating and doing bits and pieces.
Yeah.
How have you found the soundproofing result?
I've been in the room quite often whilst we've had tradesmen in, radios on and things like that, and we've also actually had customers in the room adjacent to us or right next door. We haven't heard a peep from them coming through the wall. They've had televisions on and normal kind of day-to-day pattern of life. Certainly from this side I haven't heard anything, and we haven't heard any comments from customers to say that they've heard tradesmen and decorators and radios that have been on in this room transferring into the next door room. So from my perspective, it's been a successful job.
Absolutely brilliant result. That's exactly what we were hoping for.
Perfect.
So what an absolutely fantastic result. It's been a pleasure to be a part of helping this absolutely fantastic venue to solve a noise problem that they've got, allow guests to have a much more peaceful and relaxing time. And if you've got a similar problem, if you've got a stud wall at home, in an office, in a hotel or anywhere else, and you're interested in our soundboard for, or of course any other noise problem, whether it's floors, walls, ceilings or anything else, then do get in touch. You can visit us at soundproofingstore.co.uk or give us a call. We're here to help.